Where is it? Where's my scarf? Charles Whitmore's voice rang out across the crowded waiting area of Chicago Union Station, sharp and urgent enough to make several nearby passengers turn instinctively toward him. Claire Donovan looked up from the tablet resting on her lap. Which scarf, sir? My wool scarf. Claire. The gray-blue one. Claire immediately set the tablet aside and bent down to check beneath the row of seats, around the legs of his leather briefcase, and in the empty space beside Charles's suitcase. Across from them, a family sharing pastries glanced over. An older man wearing a Chicago Bears cap paused halfway through opening his newspaper and watched with curiosity. I don't see a scarf anywhere, Claire said, still scanning the floor. Are you certain you brought it with you? Charles did not answer at once. He shoved one hand into the inside left pocket of his coat, then into the right. Nothing. He began searching his outer pockets next, again and again, his movements growing more frantic with each failed attempt, as though looking harder might somehow make the scarf reappear. The gray-blue wool scarf, he said, his voice roughening with tension. I folded it and put it in this pocket before I left the house. He struck the pocket over his chest with the flat of his hand. It was right here. Claire glanced up at the electronic departure board. Their train to Milwaukee had just been delayed another 20 minutes because of a signal problem north of the station. The red notice blinked among the other departures, making the already restless atmosphere feel even more strained. Maybe it fell near the boarding area, she said. I can ask station staff to check. It never made it to the platform. Then perhaps you dropped it while taking out your ticket or your phone. Charles turned to look at her, and something in his expression caused Claire's next words to die in her throat. I know I brought it with me, and I know it was in my coat pocket. Claire rose, walked behind the row of seats, and looked down the aisle where travelers moved past with rolling suitcases, their boots still wet from melted snow. She bent to check beneath an empty chair at the end of the row, then returned. Mr. Whitmore, the scarf is not here. Charles stared at her as though her confirmation had made the loss more real, and somehow worse. Claire lowered her voice, trying to remain calm. Listen to me. If we cannot find it, I can buy you another one before we board. There are winter clothing shops inside the station, or I can have several new scarves waiting at the hotel in Milwaukee. Wool, cashmere, whatever you prefer. Charles rose so abruptly that the leather briefcase at his feet struck the metal leg of the chair. Another one? Claire faltered. I only mean that you do not have to travel in this weather without a scarf. Do you have any idea how much that scarf means to me? Claire fell silent. Charles clenched his jaw, but when he spoke again, the anger in his voice had given way to a panic he could barely hide. It cannot be replaced. Not with cashmere. Not with 10 scarves delivered to a hotel room. Not with anything you can order through a single phone call. Claire straightened. Her expression softened slightly. I did not know, sir. No. Charles let out a dry, bitter laugh. Of course you didn't. No one does. Claire pressed her lips together. She looked away briefly, then said quietly, though not quietly enough to prevent him from hearing her. If you were the one who put the scarf in your coat pocket, then I do not know where else to look except the places you have already been. Charles turned sharply toward her. What did you just say? Claire met his eyes, her voice still steady. I said we should retrace your steps from the moment we entered the station. For an instant, Charles looked ready to answer with something harsher. Instead, he said nothing. He only reached for the empty pocket over his chest again, this time more slowly, more gently. It was that small gesture that made Claire realize he was not simply angry over a lost possession. He was genuinely terrified. The scarf was small, hardly larger than a folded handkerchief when neatly put away. It had been knitted from gray-blue wool that had softened with age. Near one edge was a loose thread that had been there for years, yet Charles had never allowed anyone to cut it off or repair it. Claire picked up her tablet and folder, her tone becoming more practical. Try to remember. Where did you stop after we arrived at the station? Charles turned toward the main concourse. Travelers gathered beneath the soaring ceiling, clutching hot cups of coffee, checking their phones or looking up at the departure board. Thick winter coats filled the walkways, and beyond the large glass doors, snow still blanketed the sidewalks and streets of Chicago. The entrance, he said slowly. The departure board. Claire nodded. And after that? Charles swallowed. Coffee. The coffee stand near the waiting area. The memory returned at once. He had stood at the counter waiting for a black coffee while taking a phone call from Milwaukee. A young black woman in a navy apron had handed him a paper cup with a cardboard sleeve and warned him that it had just been brewed and was very hot. He had taken out his wallet, paid her, slipped it back inside his coat, then hurried away when Claire reminded him that boarding time was approaching. His hand had gone into the very same pocket that held the scarf. Charles grabbed his leather briefcase. "Come on." Claire looked at him. "Mr. Whitmore, the train could begin boarding at any moment. I do not care about the train, but we have a contract meeting in Milwaukee. Their office rearranged the schedules of 2 senior executives just to meet with you." Charles turned his eyes on her. The look was so cold that Claire immediately stopped speaking. "Go back to the coffee stand," he said. "Now." Claire held his gaze for 1 second, then tucked the tablet under her arm and started walking quickly. Charles followed close behind her, moving fast enough that several passengers pulling suitcases had to step hurriedly aside. "I will also check lost and found," Claire said as she struggled to keep pace with him. "Someone may have turned the scarf in. No one took that scarf to lost and found. You cannot know that. I last saw it at the coffee stand. Near a luggage cart, a middle-aged woman tugged gently at her husband's sleeve and whispered, though not quietly enough to keep Charles from hearing. Did you hear that? He just shouted at his assistant over a scarf. I suppose money cannot buy normal behavior. Her husband immediately touched her elbow. Let it go, Marjorie. Do not involve yourself in other people's business. But Charles had already heard her. He stopped so suddenly that Claire took 2 more steps before realizing he was no longer behind her. Charles turned toward the couple. His face was taut, not merely with anger, but with a pain rising so fiercely that it was nearly beyond his control. You know nothing about that scarf, he said, each word heavy, not one thing. So please keep your judgment to yourself. The woman startled and took a step back. Her husband moved half a step in front of her by instinct, though his expression held more embarrassment than challenge. Claire quickly turned back and lowered her voice. Mr. Whitmore, the coffee stand is just ahead. We should keep moving. Charles held the man's gaze for 1 more second, then turned away. But Claire could clearly see that his anger had become something far more dangerous to him, a fierce, almost desperate unease. They hurried across the station floor. They passed a line of passengers waiting for hot drinks, a mother carefully tucking her son's gloves into his coat pocket, and an elderly couple sitting close together, sharing a single paper cup of coffee against the winter cold. Then the coffee stand came into view. Behind the counter stood a young woman wearing a navy apron. Her dark curls were neatly pinned back, one hand resting near the register while the other finished handing a cup of coffee to the last customer near the pastry case. The morning rush had eased, leaving only a few people in front of the counter. When she saw Charles approaching quickly, the young woman recognized him at once. Her expression changed, as though she had been waiting for this moment far longer than the brief hour that had actually passed. She did not speak immediately. Instead, she quietly bent beneath the register and lifted a small brown paper bag, its top carefully folded shut. Charles stopped in his tracks. Claire nearly walked into his back. The young woman came around the counter, carrying the bag with both hands against her chest, as though it held something far more precious than its plain appearance suggested. Sir, she said, her voice gentle but clear. I was hoping you would come back. Charles did not answer immediately. He stood before the young woman for several seconds, motionless, as though he still could not believe that the object he had been desperately searching for was right in front of him. Then he slowly set his leather briefcase down at his feet and accepted the paper bag with both hands. You found it? It fell near the counter after you left, Annie replied. I ran toward the boarding gate to return it, but I could not catch up with you. Claire remained 1 step behind Charles. The sting of his harsh words from earlier had not completely faded, but when she saw the way he held the paper bag, she said nothing more. Charles opened the bag and took out the gray-blue wool scarf. His thumb brushed over the loose thread near its edge, as though it were a familiar habit he had repeated for years. Then he unfolded the inner layer of fabric, revealing the faded silver stitching that remained intact despite the passage of time. Annie had expected a simple thank you, perhaps a hurried nod before he returned to his delayed train. But the man standing in front of her did not look like someone who had merely recovered a lost possession. He stared at the scarf as though she had just returned a lost part of his life to him. Was it damaged? Charles asked, his voice low and rough. Annie blinked. No, sir. It is perfectly fine. Where did you keep it? I put it in a paper bag and kept it behind the register. I was afraid someone might spill coffee on it, or that it might get mixed in with ordinary lost property. Charles carefully folded the scarf once, then almost immediately opened it again. His eyes remained fixed on the words embroidered inside. Claire cleared her throat softly. Mr. Whitmore, I will let the people in Milwaukee know that you may arrive later than expected. Charles did not seem to hear her. Annie stood quietly before him, her hands clasped beneath the edge of her apron. I'm glad you came back, sir. Only then did Charles raise his eyes to her. So am I. His voice no longer carried the cold authority it had when it rang through the waiting area earlier. Now it sounded weary and strangely unguarded, as though in the space of a few minutes, he had been forced through a fear no one around him could understand. Instead of returning the scarf to his coat pocket, Charles laid it carefully across his palm. May I ask your name? Annie Brooks, sir. Something in Charles's expression changed slightly when he heard her last name. Brooks? Yes, sir. He appeared ready to ask another question, but stopped himself. Instead, Charles reached into his coat for his wallet, pulled out several bills without counting them, and extended them toward Annie. Please take this. Annie looked at the money, then back at him. What for? For taking care of the scarf. For waiting for me to come back. Annie immediately shook her head. I can't accept money for that. You returned something very important to me. I knew it must be important. That is why I kept it safe, Annie said gently. But it belonged to you. I only returned it to the right person. That is exactly why I want to thank you. You already have. Charles looked down at the money in his hand, momentarily unsettled, as though he rarely encountered a problem that money could not resolve easily. Claire stepped closer. Miss Brooks, Mr. Whitmore is only trying to show his appreciation. You do not need to feel uncomfortable. Annie offered a small, polite smile, but still shook her head. I understand. But if I took that money home, my mother would ask why I accepted payment simply for returning something that was never mine. Charles slowly lowered his hand. A customer standing near the pastry display glanced toward them, then discreetly returned his attention to his phone, as though he did not want anyone to know he was listening. Charles put the money back into his wallet. Your mother taught you that? Yes. Annie's expression softened. My mother taught me nearly everything worth remembering. Charles studied her for a moment longer, as though her simple answer had touched something deep inside him. Annie reached toward the scarf. Would you like me to put it back in the paper bag before you leave? There is still snow on your coat. The scarf could be damaged if it gets wet. Charles looked down at the scarf lying in his hand. Then, almost without thinking, he handed it back to her. Annie opened the paper bag and carefully placed the scarf inside, turning the side with the embroidered words inward so it would not rub against the paper. Just as she was about to fold the top of the bag closed, Charles suddenly asked, Did you read what was stitched into the scarf? Annie's hand paused on the fold of the paper bag. I saw it by accident when I picked it up, she said, slightly embarrassed. I was not trying to pry, sir. I was not accusing you of that. Annie folded the bag shut and handed it back to him. The words surprised me a little. Charles accepted the bag. Why? Annie hesitated. The question suddenly made the conversation feel far more personal than a simple exchange over a lost item at a busy coffee stand. Because the name Naomi is stitched inside, she replied. My mother's name is Naomi too. Claire immediately looked up. Charles did not move. In that moment, the noise of the station seemed to disappear from his ears, the rolling of suitcases across the tile floor, the train announcements overhead, the hiss of the espresso machine behind the counter. All of it faded away. What did you just say? My mother's name is Naomi, Annie repeated, beginning to feel uneasy at the change in his face. Naomi Brooks. Charles tightened his grip on the paper bag until the top crumpled in his hand. Claire stepped forward and lightly touched his arm. Mr. Whitmore? Charles pulled away from her touch without looking at her. His eyes remained fixed on Annie. Does your mother work here? Annie nodded slowly. She owns this coffee stand. I'm only working in her place today because she has been sick. She owns this stand? Charles repeated, as though he still could not understand what he had just heard. Yes. Annie frowned slightly. Do you know my mother? Charles opened his mouth, but no answer came out. Claire studied his face, then tried to draw him back to reality. Charles, it may only be a coincidence. There must be more than one woman named Naomi Brooks. Charles turned sharply toward her. The look in his eyes was so intense that Claire fell silent at once. Annie noticed the change in the way Claire addressed him. She was no longer speaking to a wealthy employer in front of strangers. Her voice carried the concern of someone who understood that Charles was facing something beyond his ability to control. My mother is supposed to be resting at home, Annie said, trying to ease the tension. Maybe she will feel better this evening. If you would like, I can tell her that you asked about her. No, Charles began, then stopped immediately. He swallowed hard. I mean, yes. Please tell her that Charles Whitmore asked about her. Annie's face paled slightly. Charles Whitmore? The voice did not come from Annie. It came from behind the counter. Annie spun around. Mum? Naomi Brooks stood in the narrow entrance beside the storage room door, one hand gripping the doorframe for support. She wore an old winter coat over a simple sweater, the buttons not fully fastened, as though she had hurried out of the house the moment she realized Annie was not answering her phone. Her face was drawn from illness and from the cold outside. At first, Naomi's eyes were only on Annie, filled with weariness and mild reproach, as though she were about to ask why her daughter had not called to tell her what was happening at the stand. Then she saw the man standing in front of Annie, holding the small paper bag. Naomi's hand slipped from the doorframe and caught the edge of the counter. Charles stared at her without blinking. The paper bag fell from his hand and landed softly on the rubber mat between them. But to Annie, the faint sound seemed like something had shattered inside the room. "Naomi," Charles breathed. Naomi did not answer. Annie had never seen her mother look at another person that way. It was not surprise. It was not confusion. It was fear, pain, and a vulnerability so raw before this stranger that Annie felt as though she had accidentally opened a door her mother had spent her entire life trying to keep locked. Charles took one step forward, then stopped. Only a few feet of tiled station floor separated them. But in his eyes, the distance seemed to contain 18 lost years, and every winter that had passed inside a lie. "They told me you were dead," he said. Charles's voice broke on the final word. Naomi's lips parted. She blinked, but tears had already begun to roll down her pale cheeks. When she finally spoke, her voice was so quiet, Annie could barely hear it. "And they told me you never wanted to see me again. If this heartbreaking reunion touched your heart, please like this video and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. Subscribe to our channel for more emotional and heartwarming stories." Charles slowly shook his head, as though denying it long enough might erase the 18 years that had been stolen from them. "I believed you were no longer alive." Naomi looked down at the paper bag lying near his feet, where the old wool scarf rested like living proof of the promise they had once made to each other. "And I lived every day believing you had chosen to forget me." Annie stood between them, her entire body turning cold despite the warmth of the coffee machine behind her. "Mom," she said, her voice full of confusion. "What is going on?" Naomi turned to look at her daughter. The tears on her face made the sorrow in her eyes even harder to bear. "Annie, I'm sorry." Those words made Annie's heart tighten. Charles looked from Naomi to Annie. For the first time, he was no longer looking at her merely as the young woman who had returned his lost scarf. He studied her dark curls, her wide, bewildered eyes, the gentle firmness at the corners of her mouth, and a terrifying suspicion began to emerge across his face. He turned back to Naomi. "How old is she?" Naomi closed her eyes for one brief second. 18. Charles went completely still. Beyond the glass doors, snow continued to fall over the streets of Chicago. Inside the station, another announcement sounded overhead, informing passengers that the Milwaukee train had been delayed again. But Charles no longer heard any of it. He simply looked at Annie, then at Naomi, his trembling hand slowly falling to his side. "Naomi," his voice was barely more than a whisper. "Is she?" Naomi broke down before he could finish the question. "Yes," she said. "Annie is your daughter." Naomi's knees gave way before anyone could answer. "Mom!" Annie rushed around the counter and caught her under one arm, but Naomi's weight pulled them both against the cabinet door. Charles moved forward instinctively, then stopped when Naomi recoiled from his hand, as though even now she could not bear to be touched by him. "I'm fine," she said, though the words came thin and uneven. "No, you're not." Annie slipped an arm around her waist. "You should never have come here. I called you twice. My phone was under the register." Naomi pressed one hand against her chest. Her breathing had become shallow. Charles saw it, and every question in him gave way to the immediate fact of her body struggling in front of him. "Claire, call an ambulance." Naomi lifted her head. "No, Naomi, I said no ambulance." She closed her eyes for a second, gathering enough strength to continue. "I am not getting a bill for a ride across town because you suddenly appeared at my counter." Annie's face tightened. "Mom, this isn't about him. You're having chest pain. I've had it before. That does not make it better." Claire had already taken out her phone but paused, watching Annie. Annie looked at her mother. "Either we call an ambulance, or I take you to urgent care right now. Those are the choices." Naomi tried to smile, but it failed before it formed. "You sound like me." "Good. Then listen to yourself." For a long moment, Naomi stood supported by her daughter, her eyes fixed on the paper bag lying near Charles's shoe. Then she nodded once. "Urgent care," she said, "not an ambulance." Claire arranged a car before Charles could speak again. Annie found Mr. Delaney near the newspaper stand and asked him to tell Samuel Carter, The maintenance supervisor Naomi trusted that the stand had to close early. By the time she pulled down the metal shutter, Naomi had lowered herself into a chair near the entrance, her face pale beneath the station lights. Charles kept several feet away. He could feel Claire watching him, waiting for instruction, but he had none to give. The woman he had mourned for nearly 2 decades sat 10 yards from him, alive and ill and refusing the help he once would have assumed he had the right to provide. When the car arrived, Annie helped Naomi into the back seat. Charles moved toward the door. Naomi looked up at him. No. He stopped. She needs me, he said. She needs me, Annie answered, not sharply, but with a steadiness that left no room for argument. You can follow if you need answers. But right now she needs quiet. Charles nodded. Claire opened the door of a second car without speaking. At the clinic, Naomi was taken behind a curtain within minutes. A nurse asked questions while Annie answered the ones her mother tried to dismiss. The previous chest pain, the cardiology appointment she had postponed, the fatigue, the fever that morning. Charles heard enough from the waiting area to understand that Naomi's illness had not arrived with him. It had been there already, folded into her daily life like another expense she could not afford to face. Annie came out after 20 minutes and sat 3 chairs away from him. She still wore the navy apron beneath her coat. A faint coffee stain marked one cuff. Claire had gone to make calls in the hallway. Charles held the brown paper bag on his lap. The scarf inside it safer now than the woman who had made it. Is she all right? He asked. They're running an EKG and some blood work. Annie stared at the vending machines across from them. They think she's exhausted. They also think she's been pretending not to be sick for longer than she admits. Charles nodded, unable to find a response that did not sound useless. After a silence, Annie asked, Did you really think she was dead? Yes. You never looked for her? The question was not cruel. That made it harder. I did at first. I was told she had been ill and didn't want me contacted. Then I was given a death certificate. Annie turned toward him. By who? My family's attorney. And you believed it? I had no reason to think my own mother and a man who had represented my family for years would invent a woman's death. Annie looked down at her hands. My mother doesn't keep pictures of people who hurt her. Not where I can see them, anyway. She never talked about my father. She only said he was someone she loved once, and that some doors close before you get to choose whether to walk through them. Charles's fingers closed around the edge of the paper bag. I never knew about you. I figured that out when you looked at her. Annie's voice softened, but not enough to offer comfort. A man who knew he had a daughter would not look that surprised. The doctor appeared near the doorway and called Annie's name. Charles stood too, then remained where he was when Annie went alone. A few minutes later, she returned. They want her to rest, see a cardiologist this week, and stop standing behind that counter 12 hours a day. Will she? Annie gave him a tired look. You clearly haven't met my mother for very long. Despite everything, a small sound escaped him, almost a laugh. It disappeared as Naomi emerged in a wheelchair pushed by a nurse. She looked diminished by the clinic blanket over her knees, but her gaze was clear again. I'm going home, she said to Annie. Charles stepped forward cautiously. May I speak with you? Naomi looked at the scarf bag in his hand before she looked at him. Not here. I can come tomorrow. No. She gathered the blanket closer. If we talk, it happens tonight. I have spent too many years not knowing what was true. Annie blinked. Mom, the doctor told you to rest. I can rest after I find out who lied to me. The ride to their apartment was quiet. Charles followed in the second car with Claire, watching the taillights ahead through falling snow. Naomi and Annie lived on the 3rd floor of a narrow brick building in Bronzeville. There was no doorman, no covered entrance, only salted steps, and a hallway that smelled faintly of radiator heat and someone's dinner. Inside, Naomi removed her coat slowly and sat at the small kitchen table. Annie set water beside her, then took the chair closest to her mother. Charles remained near the door until Naomi pointed to the empty seat across from her. He sat. For a while, neither of them spoke. Then Naomi said, Start with the last day you saw me. Charles laid the paper bag on the table between them. I left for New York believing I would be gone 4 days, he said. I came back believing I would never see you again. Naomi's eyes held his. And I left Chicago carrying your child, she said, because I was told you never wanted to see either of us. Naomi's words seemed to leave no air in the kitchen. Charles stared at her, then at Annie, whose hand had gone still around the glass of water she had been holding for her mother. You were pregnant? He asked. Naomi gave a brief, humorless laugh. Do not sound shocked by the part that belongs to us. Be shocked by what was done with it. I did not know. His voice dropped. Naomi, I swear to you, I did not know. I believe that now. She pressed her fingertips against the table, steadying herself. I did not believe it then. Annie looked from one face to the other. Someone told you he didn't want us? Naomi closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, she was no longer looking at the man across from her. She was looking at a room that had existed 18 years earlier. I was 29, she said. I had missed 2 periods, and I had bought a test from a drugstore 3 blocks from my apartment because I was too afraid to buy one near the bookstore where I worked. When it came back positive, I sat on the bathroom floor and cried until I started laughing. I was frightened, but I was happy. Charles leaned forward. Why didn't you call me? I did. You were already in New York. Your assistant at the time said you could not be reached until the following evening. I decided I would tell you in person when you came home. Her mouth tightened. Your mother arrived first. Charles flinched. Naomi looked at Annie. She did not yell. That would have been easier. She came to my apartment dressed as if she were attending a charity luncheon and spoke to me like I was a young woman who had misunderstood my place in the world. What did she say? Annie asked. That your father had obligations. That he had a future people had invested in. That a marriage to me would become a public mistake. He would spend years correcting. Naomi swallowed. Then she asked if I was pregnant. I did not answer quickly enough. Charles's hands curled on the table. My mother knew about Annie? She knew before you did. The radiator clicked against the wall. Outside, tires moved through slush. On the street below, Naomi continued. The next morning, Richard Vale came to see me. I recognized his name because you had mentioned him before. He brought papers, photographs of you leaving a restaurant with a woman I did not know. A typed statement saying your family had already begun preparing an engagement announcement. That never happened, Charles said immediately. There was no engagement. I know that now. Naomi's voice was controlled, but Annie saw the strain behind it. Richard told me you had learned about the pregnancy and wanted no part of it. He said if I tried to contact you, the Whitmore family would prove I was unstable and unfit. He told me people with your money did not lose custody fights to women like me. Annie's face sharpened. Women like you? Naomi met her daughter's eyes. Black, working class, alone. Charles rose from his chair, then seemed to realize he had nowhere to go. He braced one hand on the back of it. I would never have let them take our child from you. You were not there to say that. For the first time, Naomi's voice rose. Not loud enough to frighten a neighbor, but enough to make Annie look down. You were gone, Charles, and every person who came to me carried your family name, your family money, your family certainty. I was pregnant, scared, and being told the man I loved had turned my child into a problem for lawyers to solve. I came back looking for you. I had already left. Where? Milwaukee first, then St. Louis for a few months. I kept moving because Richard told me investigators would be watching. When Annie was born, I came back to Chicago because my aunt was here, and I had nowhere else left to go. Annie blinked. Aunt Denise knew? She knew I was afraid. She never knew the whole reason until years later. Naomi pushed herself up carefully. Wait here. Mom, you should sit down, Annie said. I have sat on this long enough. She walked into the narrow bedroom hallway, one hand sliding along the wall. Annie made to follow, but Naomi returned before she could rise. She carried a rectangular tin box with faded flowers painted on the lid. Annie recognized it immediately. It had lived on the top shelf of her mother's closet for as long as she could remember, always beneath folded blankets, always off limits, without Naomi ever needing to say so. Naomi set it on the table. I thought this was sewing stuff, Annie said. There is some thread in it. Naomi lifted the lid. Just not only thread. At the top lay a folded photograph. Naomi picked it up and passed it to Annie. The picture showed her mother younger, her hair loose over one shoulder, standing by the frozen edge of Lake Michigan with Charles beside her. He was smiling in a way Annie had not yet seen in the man sitting across from them. Naomi wore a long coat and held a skein of gray-blue wool under one arm. Annie looked at the paper bag on the table. The scarf. I made it that winter, Naomi said. Charles took the photograph only after Annie offered it. His thumb hovered above Naomi's younger face but did not touch it. Below the photograph were 2 ticket stubs from a jazz club, a dried sprig of lavender pressed inside wax paper, a square of gray-blue yarn, and an envelope marked with Charles's name in Naomi's handwriting. You wrote to me? He asked. 3 times. 2 letters came back unopened. That one I never mailed. By then, I believed there was no point in begging a man to care. Charles reached toward the envelope, then stopped. May I? Naomi nodded. He unfolded the letter slowly. Annie could not see the words, but she watched his face as he read. His lips pressed together when he reached the middle of the page. What does it say? She asked. Charles handed it to her without speaking. The paper had softened at the folds. Annie read her mother's young handwriting. Charles, I do not know whether Richard told me the truth, but I cannot risk the baby to find out. I wanted you to know there is a child. Whatever you have chosen, I will love this baby enough for both of us. I wish you had told me yourself. Annie stopped reading. Naomi reached deeper into the box and removed another paper. An ultrasound printout, its edges bent with age, followed by Annie's birth certificate. The line for father was blank. Charles lowered himself back into the chair. I had a daughter. You have a daughter, Naomi said. Annie folded the letter with care and put it back on the table. Her chest felt tight, though not with tears alone. She had wanted answers for years without admitting it. Now each answer seemed to take something from her. Did you ever plan to tell me? She asked her mother. Naomi's eyes filled. I planned to tell you when I could explain it without making you feel unwanted. But I was unwanted, Annie said. Not by you, by them. And I had a right to know that. Yes, Naomi whispered. You did. Charles looked at Annie. I will take a DNA test. Tomorrow. Tonight. If there is somewhere open, you do not owe me belief, because I am sorry. Annie studied him. She did not see a father yet. She saw a man holding a scarf and an old letter, as though both had finally become heavier than he could carry. I want the test, she said. Not because I think my mother lied, because no one gets to take the truth away from us again. Charles nodded once. Naomi covered Annie's hand with her own. Across the table, Charles did not reach for either of them. For the first time that evening, Annie was grateful for that. The testing center occupied the second floor of a medical building not far from the lake, above a pharmacy and a dental office with a cartoon tooth painted on the window. Charles arrived before Naomi and Annie, though he remained in his car until he saw them come through the revolving door. He understood enough now not to be waiting for them in every room before they had decided whether they wanted him there. Annie noticed him when he entered the lobby behind them. Naomi noticed too, but said nothing. She wore the same dark coat from the day before, buttoned all the way to her throat, and moved carefully, refusing Annie's arm until they reached the elevator. The test itself took less time than the paperwork. Annie signed her name where the technician pointed. Charles did the same. Naomi sat beside the window, her purse held in both hands, looking out at the traffic below as though she had already lived through the most difficult part, and did not know why her heart was still racing. We can rush the results, Charles said when the receptionist explained the standard wait. Annie looked at him. How long is standard? 3 business days, the receptionist answered. Then 3 days is fine. Charles nodded. 3 days. It was the first time he accepted one of her decisions without trying to make the process faster. The results came on a Friday afternoon. Annie had asked that the envelope be delivered to her apartment, not to Charles's office. When Claire brought it upstairs, she did not step inside. She handed it to Annie with a quiet, "Your mother should have my number in case she needs anything," then returned to the hallway. Charles stood by the kitchen sink. He had not removed his coat. Naomi sat at the table, where the tin box remained closed near the sugar jar, as though putting it away again would mean pretending too much. Annie opened the envelope herself. There were several pages, a laboratory seal, a set of numbers she did not understand at first, and then one sentence that required no interpretation. Probability of paternity, 99.99%. She read it once, then held the pages out toward Charles. He did not take them immediately. Are you all right? Annie almost laughed. The question was too small for what had just happened. I don't know. That is fair. She set the results on the table instead. Charles lowered himself into the chair across from Naomi. His eyes moved over the page, and for a moment, his hand covered his mouth. Naomi watched him. You believe me now? He looked up quickly. I believed you before this. No, she said, not bitterly. You hoped I was telling the truth. That is not the same thing. He accepted that without defense. Then I know now. And I am sorry the knowing came 18 years late. Annie crossed to the refrigerator and took out a pitcher of water because she needed something ordinary to do. When she opened the door, Charles saw what she had been standing in front of. A cardiology bill clipped beneath a grocery coupon, a rent reminder, and an envelope from Lakeshore College of Nursing with a deposit deadline printed in bold near the bottom. His eyes stopped there a second too long. Naomi followed his gaze. Do not. I haven't said anything. You were about to. Annie placed 3 water glasses on the table. Mom. No, she's right, Charles said. I was about to. He looked at Annie first, then Naomi. There is no reason either of you should be worried about medical bills or tuition or this apartment. I can take care of those things immediately. The clinic, the rent, the school deposit, whatever is needed. Naomi leaned back in her chair. The exhaustion in her face did not soften her voice. You found out you have a daughter less than 5 minutes ago, and already you are trying to pay for the parts of her life you did not see. That is not what I mean. It is exactly what you mean. You may mean it kindly, but it is still what you are doing. Charles glanced at Annie. I am her father. You are biologically her father, Naomi said. The rest has not happened yet. Annie kept her hands around her glass. She had imagined having a father in vague, childish ways when she was younger. Someone in the audience at school programs, someone teaching her to drive, someone she could call when the radiator stopped working or her mother came home too tired to eat. She had never imagined a man she barely knew looking at her college envelope, as if a wire transfer could cross every empty seat he had never occupied. Charles spoke carefully. I cannot change what was taken from us, but I can help with what is happening now. Naomi's hand moved to the edge of the table. Do not walk into my life with a check before you walk into the truth. The room went still. Charles lowered his eyes. Naomi continued. I did not spend 18 years raising your daughter so that the first thing she learns about her father is that guilt makes him generous. Annie does not need to be bought into your family. I do not need to be rescued before anyone admits what was done to me. I am not trying to buy either of you. Then prove it. How? Find out who forged my death. Find out who kept my letters from you. Find out who knew Annie existed and decided she was easier to erase than accept. Naomi took a breath, and Annie immediately looked toward her. But she lifted a hand to signal she was all right. Your mother did not do this alone. Richard Vale stood in front of me with papers and threats. If he frightened me into leaving, he may have left a trail somewhere. Charles looked at the DNA report, then at the old tin box. His face had gone quiet in a way Annie had not seen before. The grief was still there, but it had taken on direction. I will find it, he said. Naomi shook her head. Do not promise what you have not done. He nodded after a moment. Then I will begin. Annie took the nursing school envelope from the refrigerator and slid it into a drawer. Charles saw the gesture and did not offer again. When he rose to leave, he placed a business card on the counter, face down, and wrote Claire's number on the back. Not money, he said. Only a way to reach me that does not pass through anyone in my family. Naomi considered it, then left the card where it was. At the door, Annie spoke for the first time in several minutes. Mr. Whitmore? He turned. Find out what happened to my mother first. Charles looked at her, the daughter whose existence had just become official on a printed page and whose trust was still nowhere within his reach. I will, he said. This time, Naomi did not tell him not to promise. Charles did not go home after leaving Naomi's apartment. He asked his driver to take him downtown, then spent the ride with his phone in his hand and no idea whom he trusted enough to call first. By the time he reached his office, most of the building had gone dark. The cleaning crew moved quietly through the lobby, and the guard at the desk straightened when Charles crossed the marble floor in the same coat he had worn to the station days earlier. Claire was still in her office, finishing the Milwaukee rescheduling he had abandoned. She looked up when he appeared in her doorway. I assume the meeting will be postponed again, she said. The DNA results came back. Her fingers stopped above the keyboard. Annie is my daughter. Claire removed her glasses and placed them on the desk. Whatever irritation remained from the scene at the station disappeared from her face. Does she know? She opened the report herself. And Naomi? She asked me to find out what happened to her. Claire studied him for a moment. Do you believe something criminal was done? My mother told me Naomi died. Richard Vale gave me a death certificate. Naomi says Richard threatened her while she was pregnant and told her I wanted nothing to do with the child. Charles came farther into the room. I need proof, not family explanations, not a conversation where everyone suddenly remembers things differently. Proof. Claire closed the file on her screen. Then this cannot run through your mother's office or the Whitmore Family Council. I know. We use outside counsel, a forensic document examiner if necessary, and a private investigator who has never worked for the family. Charles nodded. Set it up. She reached for a legal pad. What do we have to start with? A death certificate Richard gave me in 2008. It may be in my personal files or the archive from my old residence. There may also be communications from my mother during that period, payments from family trusts, anything connected to Richard, Naomi Brooks, or investigators retained around the time she disappeared. Claire wrote each item down. And Annie? What about her? If your family knew Naomi was pregnant, there may be records relating to the child. A birth search, school enrollment, address reports. Something intended to make sure Naomi stayed away. Charles looked at her. The possibility had been present since Naomi spoke, but hearing it aloud made it harder to keep standing. They may have known about Annie all this time. Claire did not soften it. Yes. The following morning, Claire arrived at his house with a gray archival box recovered from a storage facility in Evanston. It held documents Charles had not touched since the years after Naomi's supposed death. Condolence letters, estate notices from unrelated family matters, old appointment calendars, and a cream-colored envelope marked with Richard Vale's firm name. Charles opened it at his dining table. Inside was the death certificate. Naomi Brooks, age 29. Complications following a cardiac illness. Date of death, the 14th of March, 2008. The paper bore an embossed seal and the name of a hospital on the south side. For 18 years, he had remembered that page as indisputable. Now the paper looked less like evidence than a prop laid in front of a grieving man who had been too broken to question the handwriting. Claire placed a call through outside counsel. Before noon, they had their first answer. The hospital has no record of Naomi Brooks being admitted or dying there, Claire said from across the table. Their records administrator checked under her full name and date of birth. Nothing. Charles looked at the certificate again. The county council is verifying separately, but the certificate number is not formatted the way Cook County records were issued that year. He let out a breath through his nose. Richard handed this to me himself. I know. He sat in my office and told me there would be no service because Naomi's family wanted privacy. Claire's voice remained level. A lie told once can be called fear or panic. A lie maintained for 18 years is a decision. Charles folded the certificate back into its envelope, though his hands no longer managed the edges cleanly. The next documents came from the Whitmore Family Trust. Claire obtained them through corporate access Charles still controlled, careful to copy the files before any inquiry could alert Richard or Evelyn. In April 2008, 3 weeks after the date on the false death certificate, Richard Vale had received a payment of $180,000 from an account used for private family matters. The description read, Family Risk, Consultation, and Resolution. Resolution, Charles said. Claire placed another sheet beside it. There is more. Smaller payments followed over the next decade, issued to a firm called Lakefront Investigative Services. The invoices were deliberately vague. Location confirmation, background monitoring, exposure review. They were watching her, Charles said. It appears so. Can we get the reports? Outside counsel subpoenaed archived business records informally first. The firm closed 5 years ago, but one former partner kept digital backups for compliance purposes. He provided these after being shown your authorization and Richard's payment trail. Claire opened a thin folder. The first report contained an address in Milwaukee where Naomi had stayed briefly. The second placed her back in Chicago, living with a relative. Then came a report dated 8 months after Annie's birth. Charles read it twice before the meaning settled. Subject: Naomi Brooks observed departing pediatric clinic, accompanied by infant female, approximate age 6 months. Child believed to be daughter of subject. No direct contact made. There were later pages, an apartment address, a public school registration district, Naomi's coffee vendor permit at Union Station. One entry from 6 years earlier noted Annie by name, Annie Brooks. Minor child residing with subject. No indication of approach toward Whitmore family or media. Continued monitoring unnecessary, unless circumstances change. Charles pushed his chair back, the legs scraping against the hardwood. They knew her name. Claire said nothing. My mother knew I had a child, and she watched Naomi raise her alone to make sure they never came near me. The scarf lay on a nearby side table where he had placed it upon entering the house. He crossed the room and picked it up, pressing the wool between his fingers until the loose thread curled around his thumb. 18 years ago, he had believed grief was the cruelest thing his family had allowed him to suffer. He understood now that grief had been the mercy they gave him. Naomi had carried the fear, the rent, the sickness, The questions from a little girl who had grown into a young woman without ever knowing she had been deliberately hidden. Claire rose and gathered copies into a folder. Charles, before you confront anyone, we need the originals secured. Richard may destroy whatever remains if he realizes you know. He nodded without turning. Secure everything. And your mother? He looked down at the silver words sewn inside the scarf. Tomorrow, he said, I'm going to ask her how many years she watched me mourn a woman she knew was still alive. Evelyn Whitmore received her son in the west sitting room at 4 the next afternoon. She had chosen the room because it caught the last of the winter light, and because she had always believed difficult conversations should take place somewhere orderly. A silver tea service rested untouched on the table between 2 cream-colored chairs. Behind her, portraits of Whitmore men in dark suits climbed the wall in gilded frames. Charles remained standing. You said it was urgent, Evelyn said. I assumed it concerned the Milwaukee project. He took the gray-blue scarf from his coat pocket and placed it on the table beside the tea tray. For the first time since he entered, her composure shifted, only slightly. Her eyes rested on the wool, then returned to his face. Where did you get that? I have carried it for 18 years. I thought you had put away those old things. Old things? Charles repeated. Is that what Naomi was to you? Evelyn reached for her teacup, then decided against it. Charles, I do not know what has happened, but you are clearly upset. I saw her. The silence that followed was clean and immediate. He had spent the drive expecting denial. Surprise. Perhaps even the performance of a woman receiving impossible news. Evelyn gave him none of that. Her face did not blanch. She did not ask who he meant. Charles felt the last fragile part of him still hoping for another explanation collapse. You knew, he said. Evelyn looked toward the window. I knew she survived whatever difficult years came after she left. She did not leave. You forced her out. I prevented a reckless situation from destroying your life. Charles took an envelope from inside his coat and threw the copied death certificate onto the table. It slid against the silver tray. You told me she died. You were inconsolable. At the time, there was no benefit in prolonging an attachment that had already become impossible. Impossible because she was black? Evelyn's eyes hardened. Do not reduce this to something crude. Then give it its proper name. She was poor. She was young. She had no understanding of the world you were expected to enter. She was the woman I loved. You were 30 years old and prepared to throw away generations of work over a romance. Charles stared at her. She was pregnant. Evelyn said nothing. The refusal to pretend was worse than a confession. He stepped closer to the table. You knew I had a daughter. I knew there was a child. Her name is Annie. Evelyn's expression remained still. I am sure she has been well cared for. By her mother alone. While you paid men to watch them, that reached her. She looked at the pages in his hand, then back at him. You went through trust records? I went through the grave you built for a living woman. Lower your voice. No. The single word struck the room harder than shouting would have. Evelyn rose. Though age had narrowed her shoulders, she retained the habit of authority. Everything you have, everything you became, exists because someone in this family was willing to make decisions you were too emotional to make for yourself. Charles laughed once, without amusement. You watched me carry her scarf into every winter of my life. You watched me refuse marriage, children, any hope of another family, and you called that protection? You became one of the most successful men in this city. Successful is not the same as whole. Her mouth compressed. And what now? You intend to invite this woman and her daughter into your home? Into the company? Into the public record? Do you understand what they may expect once they realize what your name means? Charles leaned over the table and picked up the scarf. Annie found this on the floor of a train station. She could barely afford to leave her mother's coffee counter unattended, and when I offered her money for returning it, she refused. She had more honor in one morning than this family has shown in 18 years. Evelyn looked away first. Richard handled the details, she said. If papers were prepared, that was his judgment. Richard acted for you. He acted to protect this family. Charles folded the scarf with care. You do not get to call it family after deciding my child was an inconvenience. He turned toward the door. Charles. For the first time, there was urgency in Evelyn's voice. Think before you make this public. The press will not be kind to her. They will examine every bill she failed to pay, every place she lived, every choice she made. You may believe you are rescuing Naomi, but you could expose her daughter to a life neither of them is prepared for. He paused with his hand on the doorframe. That threat might have worked when Naomi was alone and pregnant. he said. Do not make the mistake of thinking she is alone now. At the coffee stand that evening, Naomi moved more slowly than Annie liked. She had insisted on opening for 4 hours, saying rent would not wait for a cardiologist to approve her schedule. Annie handled the register while her mother prepared cups, though she watched Naomi every time she reached for the milk cooler. Samuel Carter arrived after the commuter rush, wearing his maintenance jacket and carrying a small paper sack. Soup from my wife, he said, setting it behind the counter. She said coffee is not dinner, no matter how much you sell. Naomi managed to smile. Tell Ruth thank you. Samuel studied her face. You look like a woman who has been carrying a box too long. Annie glanced toward her mother, then quietly went to restock lids at the far end of the counter. Naomi wiped a clean surface that did not need wiping. Annie's father came back. Samuel did not interrupt. He did not know about her, Naomi said. His family made sure of that. Samuel leaned one elbow on the counter. And now he says he wants the truth. But the truth comes with his name attached to it. His mother. Lawyers. Reporters. Maybe. Naomi shook her head. I survived being left alone. I do not know if Annie should have to survive being noticed by people like them. Samuel considered that. You think keeping quiet protects her? I think it keeps her life hers. Maybe. He spoke gently. Or maybe it leaves her believing her mother was someone powerful people could hurt and never answer for. Naomi stopped moving. You are not fighting to win back a rich man, Samuel said. You are fighting so your daughter knows her mother was never unworthy of being loved. Across town, Evelyn stood in the sitting room after Charles had gone, her untouched tea cold beside the copied death certificate. At last, she picked up the phone. Richard, she said when he answered, Charles knows about Naomi. And the girl. There was a pause. Then Richard said, leave it to me. The next afternoon, Naomi was at the coffee stand before Annie finished objecting. You promised the doctor you would cut back, Annie said, carrying a sleeve of paper cups from the storage closet. I did cut back. I opened at noon instead of 6. That is not what he meant. Naomi adjusted the pastry case, though there were only 3 muffins inside and each was already facing the same direction. The rent is still due on the 1st. Prescriptions are still due when the pharmacist hands them over. I cannot wrest my way out of that. Annie wanted to argue, but a man in a heavy parka approached for coffee. She took his order while Naomi reached for the pot. For the next hour, the stand stayed busy enough to keep both of them from talking about Charles, his mother, or what it meant that a family with money had spent 18 years deciding what they were allowed to know. By mid-afternoon, the commuter rush thinned. Snow had stopped outside, leaving the windows gray with slush and the concourse marked by damp tracks from hundreds of shoes. Annie carried a carton of lids into the stockroom behind the stand and knelt to fit it beneath the lower shelf. When she heard her mother say, Richard Vale, she froze. Annie had never heard the name in person, only from Naomi's account at the kitchen table. She moved close enough to the half-open stockroom door to see part of the counter through the gap. Richard was older than she had imagined. He wore a black wool coat, dark gloves, and polished shoes that had not collected much station salt. His silver hair was arranged neatly, and he held his hat by the brim, as though he had stopped by for a polite conversation rather than entered the life of a woman he had helped ruin. Naomi, he said, it has been a long time. Not long enough. Richard glanced at the menu board. You built a modest little business for yourself. I did not build it for your approval. No, I suppose not. His voice remained calm. I heard Charles found you. Naomi kept one hand flat on the counter. Charles found out what you did. Charles is emotional right now. He has been presented with a story that makes him feel guilty, and guilt is powerful when a man has more money than perspective. Annie felt her fingers tighten around the carton. My daughter is not a story, Naomi said. Precisely why I came. Richard set his hat on the counter. She is young. She has plans, I assume. College, perhaps. A career. You should consider whether public attention from the Whitmore family is the kind of inheritance you want to hand her. Naomi's breathing changed. Annie could hear it from the stockroom, short and careful. Richard continued, reporters will not treat her gently. They will call her Charles Whitmore's secret child. They will examine her grades, her friends, her fatherless upbringing, your financial history. They will suggest you remained quiet until there was money to be gained. Get out. I am trying to save you from making the same mistake twice. Naomi stared at him. The first mistake was believing you. Richard's mouth shifted into something close to a smile. You believed because you understood what the alternative would cost you. That has not changed. Your coffee stand operates under a lease renewed at the discretion of the concourse management company. Those agreements can become difficult when a vendor brings unwelcome attention to the property. Annie reached into the pocket of her apron and pulled out her phone. Her thumb found the voice recorder. The small red timer began moving. Naomi said, "You threatened me when I was pregnant, and now you walk in here to threaten my daughter's future and my livelihood? I am offering perspective. Charles's mother acted in the interest of her family. You were given a chance to build a life elsewhere, and by all appearances, you did. A life built after you stole the one I chose." Richard leaned forward slightly. "Be careful, Naomi. Charles may be attentive now, but men like him return to their world eventually. When that happens, you will still have bills, a sick heart, and a daughter whose name has been dragged through newspapers." Annie stepped out from the stockroom. "That's enough." Naomi turned. "Annie, go back." "No." She came around the side of the counter, phone held at her waist. "He doesn't get to come here and talk to you like that." Richard's eyes settled on her with an interest that made Annie's skin crawl. "So this is Annie. You knew my name already," she said. His pause lasted less than a second, but it was enough. Annie lifted her phone. "I recorded you." Naomi's eyes widened. Richard's face did not change, though his gloved hand closed around the brim of his hat. "Young lady, you should be very careful making accusations based on a conversation you do not understand. I understand that you knew who I was before you walked in. I understand that you threatened my mother's lease, and I understand that you're afraid of what happens when my father hears it." "Your father?" Richard gave a thin smile. "You have adapted to that word quickly." The cruelty of it struck Annie, but she did not lower the phone. "My mother has already given you 18 years of silence," she said. "You do not get another day." Richard looked at Naomi. "This is what public exposure does. It teaches children to mistake insolence for strength." Naomi stepped out from behind the counter. She was pale, but her voice held. "No, I taught her that. Now leave." For the first time, Richard's composure slipped. He picked up his hat and leaned close enough that Annie could smell winter air on his coat. "You may find," he said quietly, "that a coffee stand is not much protection against a family name like Whitmore." Then he turned and walked into the concourse without hurry. Naomi gripped the counter until her knuckles whitened. "Mom, sit down." "I am all right." "You are shaking." "So are you." Annie looked at the phone in her hand. The timer was still running. She stopped the recording and saved it twice, then emailed a copy to herself before she could think better of it. "Do we call Charles?" she asked. Naomi closed her eyes. "I do not know." Annie thought of the business card Charles had left on their kitchen counter, with Claire's number written on the back. Charles was still too new, too tangled with every hurt in her mother's face. Claire had been quiet at the clinic, and she had not tried to force herself into their apartment when she delivered the DNA results. "I'll call his assistant," Annie said. "Not him, not yet," Claire answered on the second ring. "This is Annie Brooks. Richard Vale was just at my mother's stand." Annie looked at Naomi, who gave one exhausted nod. "I recorded what he said. I think Charles needs to hear it." An hour later, Charles stood in his office with Claire beside his desk as Annie's recording played through the speakers. He did not interrupt once. When Richard's voice threatened the lease, Charles put both hands on the desk and lowered his head. When Richard revealed he knew Annie's name, Charles closed his eyes. The recording ended with Annie's voice, young and steady. "My mother has already given you 18 years of silence. You do not get another day." Claire stopped the file. Charles stood motionless. "She should never have had to do that," he said. "No," Claire answered. "But she did it well." He looked toward the window, where evening had settled over the city. "I told her she did not need to be part of this fight." Claire gathered her tablet. "She was born inside it, Charles." His face tightened. Those were almost the same words Annie had left in the message attached to the recording. "I am not stepping into this. I am finally stepping out of it." Charles picked up the scarf from the corner of his desk and folded it once in his palm. "Get outside counsel on the phone," he said, "and find out who controls the lease on that coffee stand." Richard had tried to frighten Naomi into silence again. This time, he had left his own voice behind. 3 days after Richard's visit, Annie received a call from Claire while she was arranging muffins behind the glass case. "Mr. Whitmore asked me to make something clear before I say anything else," Claire began. "This is not an offer conditioned on your answer. And it is not a public gesture." Annie tucked the phone between her shoulder and ear. Naomi was at a cardiology appointment Samuel had insisted on driving her to, leaving Annie alone at the stand for the morning. "What is it?" "He knows you are interested in nursing." Lakeshore has an open house session this afternoon for admitted students and late applicants. He wondered whether you would allow him to take you. Annie glanced at the envelope she had brought from home, still folded inside her backpack beneath the counter. Why doesn't he ask me himself? He thought you might find it easier to say no to me. That was thoughtful enough to unsettle her. I'll go, Annie said. But I'm taking the train there. He can meet me. Claire paused. I think he will understand. Charles was waiting near the entrance of Lakeshore College of Nursing when Annie arrived, carrying no briefcase and wearing an overcoat that looked too formal beside the students in sweatshirts and winter boots. He did not reach for her or use a familiar greeting he had not earned. Thank you for coming, he said. I was going to visit eventually. Then I am glad I did not make you miss it. They joined a small tour led by a second-year student named Kiara, who showed them a lecture hall, a simulation lab, and a room lined with hospital beds occupied by practice mannequins. Annie's attention changed the moment she stepped inside. She asked about clinical placement, evening courses, and whether students could work part-time during the first year. Charles listened rather than speaking for her. In the hallway, Kiara handed Annie a folder. There are scholarship forms in the back. Apply for everyone, even the ones you think you won't get. Somebody has to receive them. Annie smiled. Thank you. After the tour, she and Charles sat in the campus cafe with 2 cups of coffee neither of them had touched. Outside, snowmelt ran from the roof into a gutter with a steady metallic tap. You belong here, Charles said. Annie ran her finger along the edge of the folder. I'd like to. You can. She looked up. Please don't. I haven't said anything yet. You were about to. A trace of embarrassment crossed his face. Your mother says the same thing. She usually knows. Charles nodded. I can pay for school, Annie. Tuition, books, housing if you need it. You should not have to postpone this because your mother is sick, or because you both have bills that never should have been yours alone. The words were gentle, but they still pressed against a place in her that was not ready. I want college, she said. I do, but I don't want the first thing you give me as my father to be something I have to wonder whether I earned. You earned admission. Paying for it would not change that. No, but I barely know you. She folded the scholarship folder closed. Yesterday, you were a man whose scarf I found. Then you became the reason my mother cried in the kitchen. Now you're my father, and you want to solve my future before you know anything about the life I already have. Charles held her gaze, though the hurt in his face was plain. What should I do instead? Annie had not expected him to ask. Come by the stand, she said after a moment. Order coffee, ask how my mother is feeling, and wait for the actual answer. Ask me why I want to be a nurse instead of assuming it is because we need money. Be there long enough that I don't have to wonder whether you only feel guilty. Charles looked down at his untouched cup. That seems fair. It is not punishment. I know. He raised his eyes again. It may be the first fair thing anyone has required of me in this matter. The following week, he came to the coffee stand 3 times. He waited in line, paid for a large black coffee, and left a normal tip after Annie told him $20 in the jar would only make her mother suspicious. On Tuesday, he learned Naomi disliked decaf but had been ordered to drink it. On Thursday, he listened while Annie explained that nursing was not a backup plan. It was the first job she had ever seen where knowing when someone was scared mattered as much as knowing what medicine they needed. Naomi remained careful with him, but she stopped asking Annie to take his coffee before he reached the counter. Once, when Charles offered to carry a carton of supplies from Samuel's cart, she let him. It was almost ordinary until Friday morning. Naomi opened the stand's mail while Annie counted the register. She read the first page, then the second, and sat down on the stool behind the counter without taking off her coat. Mom? Naomi held out the letter. It was a notice of lease termination. The stand had 7 days to vacate due to alleged operational violations and negative publicity affecting the concourse vendor environment. Annie read the paragraph twice. What violations? There aren't any. Charles arrived 20 minutes later and found Naomi sitting behind a closed register while Annie paced inside the small space beside the pastry case. Claire was with him, already carrying a folder. They cannot do this, Charles said after reading the notice. They already did, Naomi replied. Claire placed the folder on the counter. The property management company received a complaint through a consulting attorney yesterday. Richard's firm is named in the routing history. Naomi gave a tired laugh. At least he is no longer pretending. Annie held up her phone. Can the recording stop this? It will help, Claire said. But we need counsel to file properly. A man passing the stand slowed with his phone in his hand. Annie recognized the headline on the screen before he moved on. Billionaire's lost love reappears with secret daughter at train station coffee stall. Naomi saw it too. Whatever resolve had held her upright seemed to leave at once. "This is what I was afraid of," she said. "Annie, pack what matters. We can go to Denise's in Street Lewis until this quiets down." "Mom, no. They will not stop." Charles stood on the customer side of the counter, the place where he had first met his daughter without knowing it. He did not reach across for Naomi. He did not offer money. "Last time, they made you leave because they convinced you I would not choose you," he said. "This time, I am standing here where everyone can see me. I choose you. I choose Annie. And I choose the truth." Naomi looked at him, frightened and exhausted. "What does that cost you?" "Whatever it costs." Charles turned to Claire. "Send everything to outside counsel, the false certificate, the payments, the surveillance reports, the recording, and this lease notice. File against Richard. Remove my mother from every trust and company role under my authority." Claire nodded once. "And the press?" Charles looked at Naomi and Annie. "This time," he said, "they hear the truth from us first." The call came the following morning from a number Annie did not recognize. She had been packing unopened tea bags and napkin holders into a cardboard box while Naomi sat on a stool behind the coffee stand, sorting receipts they might need for the lawyer. The stand was still open for business, but few travelers approached. Some looked too long. Others hurried past with the awkward politeness of people who had already read enough online to believe they knew something private. "Annie Brooks?" a woman asked when she answered. "Yes. My name is Margaret Sloan. I represent Mrs. Evelyn Whitmore. She would appreciate the opportunity to speak with you privately this afternoon." Annie looked toward her mother. Naomi was watching her now. "About what?" "Your future. Mrs. Whitmore believes there are matters that should be discussed without unnecessary public attention." Annie understood the sentence for what it was. So did Naomi when Annie repeated it after ending the call. "No," Naomi said at once. "You are not going into that house alone. She asked for me because she thinks I'm the easiest one to scare. That is exactly why you do not go." Annie placed the phone beside the register. "Mom, she made choices about my life before I was born. I want to hear what she thinks those choices are worth." Naomi rose too quickly and put a hand against the counter until the dizziness passed. "You do not need to prove anything to her." "I'm not going to prove anything." Annie reached for her mother's hand. "I'm going because I don't want her voice living in my head as some powerful woman I never faced." Samuel, who had been replacing a loose wheel on a maintenance cart a few feet away, turned at that. "Then you do not go without someone knowing when you entered and when you are supposed to leave." Annie managed a small smile. "Yes, sir. I mean it. I know." Claire arranged a car only after Annie made it clear she was going whether Charles approved or not. Charles called once, asking if he could come with her. Annie declined. "I need to know I can stand in front of her without being hidden behind you," she said. He was quiet before answering. "Then Claire will remain outside. If you ask for her, she will come in immediately." "Thank you." It was the first time the words had passed between them without strain. Evelyn Whitmore's home stood behind stone pillars on a quiet road north of the city, its long driveway edged with shoveled snow. Annie stepped from the car in her plain black coat and boots still marked with station salt. Claire remained in the back seat, her phone visible in her hand. 20 minutes, Annie said. 20 minutes, Claire agreed. "After that I knock, whether you like it or not." Inside, a housekeeper took Annie's coat and led her through a hall lined with portraits. Men in dark jackets, women wearing pearls, children posed beside horses or sailboats. Their faces appeared certain they belonged there. Annie wondered whether Evelyn had looked at those walls when she decided a child with Naomi's skin should not be placed among them. Evelyn waited in a sitting room with a fire burning low in the hearth. She did not rise. "So," she said, studying Annie's face, "there is no denying the resemblance once one knows to look for it." Annie remained standing. "You asked to speak with me. You may sit. I'm comfortable." Evelyn gave a faint sigh, as though Annie had already confirmed something disappointing. "Your mother has raised you to be cautious." "My mother raised me." The older woman's expression cooled. She indicated a folder on the table. "Then let us avoid dramatics. The past cannot be corrected by humiliating everyone involved. It can, however, be settled in a manner that protects you and your mother." Annie opened the folder without taking a seat. The first page listed a financial trust in her name. The number made her stomach tighten. Beneath it were provisions for 4 years of tuition at any accredited university, housing expenses, medical care for Naomi, and a lump sum payment large enough that her mother would never need to sell another cup of coffee. The final pages were different. Confidentiality agreement. Waiver of public claims. Agreement not to seek recognition as an heir or public member of the Whitmore family. Annie looked up. You want to buy us. I want to prevent your mother's pain from becoming your burden. She has lived an exhausting life. This would change that. You could have changed that 18 years ago. Evelyn's fingers closed over the arm of her chair. You are young. Your understanding of what happened comes from a woman who was hurt, and a man now driven by guilt. My understanding comes from a false death certificate, paid surveillance reports, and a lawyer who threatened my mother at her place of work. Richard has always been overzealous. Did he invent all of it himself? Evelyn did not answer. Annie put the folder back on the table. Did you know my name when I was a baby? A log shifted in the fireplace. I knew enough to know you were provided for. Annie laughed once, because anything else would have broken in her throat. Provided for? My mother stood on her feet sick, because missing a day at a coffee counter meant choosing between rent and medication. I filled out college forms at our kitchen table while she hid clinic bills under coupons. You knew I existed, and that is what you call provided for? You had a mother, you had a home. Many children have less, and your son had a daughter. You took that from him too. Evelyn rose then, her face no longer controlled by good manners. My son carried a name that employed thousands of people and supported institutions across this city. Your mother represented a decision he was not prepared to understand. No, Annie said. My mother represented a decision you did not want him to make. Evelyn stepped closer. Once this reaches the press, they will not treat you as an innocent girl wronged by a family. They will tear into you. They will call you opportunistic. They will reduce your mother to the woman who appeared when there was money available. Sign those papers, and you can walk away protected. Annie took her coat from the chair where the housekeeper had laid it. You keep talking about protecting a name, she said. My mother had a name before she ever met your son. You tried to erase it because it was black, poor, and inconvenient to you. Be careful, young lady. No, you be careful. Annie slid her arms into her coat. Justice is not unfair because it embarrasses the people who cause the harm. For the first time, Evelyn looked older than powerful. Annie left the folder on the table and walked out before the woman could answer. Claire was already outside the car, watching the front door. Are you all right? She asked. Annie let out the breath she had been holding since she entered the house. Not yet, but I will be. When she reached the coffee stand, Naomi was waiting beside the closed register. Annie placed the unsigned agreement in front of her mother. Naomi opened it, read only the first page, and understood the rest. Her eyes filled, not at the amount offered, but at the daughter standing before her without it. I'm sorry you had to do that, Naomi said. Annie leaned into her mother's arms. I'm sorry you had to do it alone the first time. That evening, Charles arrived with Claire and an attorney Naomi had never met. He did not ask Annie what Evelyn had offered. Claire had already given him enough to understand. His face grew still when Naomi handed him the agreement. The statement is scheduled for tomorrow morning, he said. At the station. Outside counsel has copies of every document, including this. Naomi rested one hand on the counter. Will I have to speak? Only if you choose to. She looked at Annie, then at the stand that had carried them through years Charles had never seen. They used my silence as proof that I did not matter, Naomi said. I will not hand them that proof again. Outside the station windows, fresh snow began to fall over the tracks. By morning, the truth would no longer belong only to those who had paid to hide it. By 9 the next morning, the space beside Naomi's coffee stand no longer belonged to commuters looking for breakfast. A portable lectern had been placed near the shuttered counter, along with 2 rows of folding chairs for reporters and several cameras aimed toward the Whitmore Transit Development logo on the wall beyond it. Naomi had seen that logo every working day for years. Until Charles returned, it had been no more personal than the ticket kiosks or departure screens. Now she knew the family attached to it had shaped nearly every hardship she had carried alone. You do not have to stand through all of this, Annie said, adjusting the collar of her mother's coat. Naomi managed a small smile. I have stood through worse. Charles heard her as he approached with Claire and a woman introduced as Helen Morales, the outside attorney handling the evidence. He wore a dark suit beneath his overcoat, but the gray-blue scarf was folded in his hand rather than tucked away in his pocket. He stopped in front of Naomi. The documents have been provided to counsel. Helen will handle legal questions. If at any point you want this ended, say so. Naomi looked at the cameras gathering a few yards away. I wanted it ended 18 years ago. Today, I want it told correctly." Charles nodded. Annie noticed he did not attempt to touch her mother. He only turned toward the lectern when Helen told him the press was ready. The microphones caught the first sound of his breath. "My name is Charles Whitmore," he began, "and this morning I am speaking about actions taken by members of my family and their legal representative against Miss Naomi Brooks and her daughter, Annie Brooks." Murmurs moved through the reporters. Charles continued without looking at his prepared pages. "Nearly 19 years ago, I was in a committed relationship with Naomi Brooks. I loved her. I intended to marry her. My mother, Evelyn Whitmore, opposed that relationship because Naomi was black, because she did not come from wealth, and because my mother believed those facts made her unacceptable to this family." Naomi closed her eyes for half a second. Annie tightened her hand around hers. "I was falsely informed that Naomi had become ill and died. I was given a fraudulent death certificate by Richard Vale, an attorney acting in connection with my family. Naomi, who was pregnant with my child, was told I no longer wanted her and was threatened with the possibility of losing her baby if she attempted to contact me." A reporter called out, "Are you saying Miss Brooks's daughter is yours?" Charles turned slightly toward Annie, not claiming more than she had consented to give. "Yes," he said. "A verified DNA test confirms that Annie Brooks is my daughter. She grew up without knowing her father because people with money and influence decided they had the right to erase her from my life and me from hers." The questions began at once. Helen raised a hand, requesting silence until the statement was complete. Charles reached for the scarf on the lectern and opened it, so the silver stitching showed only to those standing close enough to see. "I learned the truth after Annie found this scarf at this station and returned it to me. She did not ask who I was. She did not ask what I could give her. She returned something precious because her mother had taught her to do what was right." His eyes moved to Naomi. "I was lied to, but Naomi and Annie were the ones made to pay for that lie. Naomi paid with fear, years of work, and the burden of raising our daughter alone. Annie paid before she was old enough to speak. I cannot return those years. I can say publicly that what happened to them was racist, deliberate, and wrong." The station seemed quieter than a station had any right to be. Even passengers who had paused only long enough to see why cameras were gathered now stood listening. Charles explained that documentation had been submitted to independent counsel, including the false certificate, payment records connected to Richard, reports showing Naomi and Annie had been monitored for years, the recorded threat made at the coffee stand, and evidence of interference with Naomi's lease. Richard Vale's association with Whitmore-controlled entities had been terminated. Evelyn Whitmore had been removed from every trust or business role under Charles's authority while counsel pursued further action. When he stepped away from the microphone, he did not invite Naomi forward with a gesture. He simply left the lectern open. Naomi took one step, then another. Annie came with her until her mother whispered, "Stay near me, but let me say this." Annie released her hand and stood at her shoulder. Naomi unfolded a single sheet of paper. After a moment, she put it down unread. "My name is Naomi Brooks," she said. "For 18 years, I believed the man I loved had learned I was carrying his child and decided we were a burden he did not want. I built a life around that pain because my daughter needed a mother more than I needed answers." Her voice trembled once. She waited, then continued, "I am not here because a wealthy man found me again. I am here because a young black woman should never learn that her mother was considered unworthy of love because of the color of her skin." A camera shutter clicked. Naomi did not turn toward it. "When I was pregnant, I was threatened by people who knew I had no money to fight them. They knew I was alone. They knew the world often believes the papers of a rich family before it believes the word of a black woman standing in a rented apartment. They used that knowledge against me." Annie wiped at her cheek, angry at the tear even as it fell. Naomi looked directly at the reporters. "Do not call this a tragic misunderstanding. Do not call it a family disagreement. My child lost her father. Charles lost his daughter. I lost the right to tell the truth about my own life. That was done through racism, intimidation, and deceit." For the first time that morning, Charles lowered his head. Naomi stepped back from the microphone. Annie reached her first, wrapping both arms around her carefully, mindful of her heart. Charles remained where he was. His face carried a question he would not force either of them to answer. Annie saw it. Still holding her mother with one arm, she extended her other hand toward him. Charles looked at Naomi before taking it. Naomi gave the smallest nod. His hand closed around Annie's, cautious and warm. It was not a reunion that erased anything. It was one public moment in which none of them had to pretend the connection did not exist. Helen answered the legal questions that followed. The coffee stand's termination notice had already been challenged and temporarily suspended. Richard's conduct had been referred for civil action and professional review. Reporters demanded a statement from Evelyn. None had been received. When the cameras finally began to shift away, Naomi looked at Charles. "Standing beside me today does not give back the years." "No," he said, "but I hope it tells you I will not spend another day hiding from what was taken." Naomi did not forgive him. Not then, but when her knees weakened as they turned from the lectern, she allowed Charles to steady her arm until Annie reached her other side. Together they walked past the closed coffee stand, through the crowd that now knew her name, and toward a future none of them yet knew how to live in. Naomi made it as far as the car before the strength left her legs. Annie saw her mother's face change and caught her elbow. Charles reached them a second later, but this time Naomi did not pull away when he took her other arm. "My chest," she said, barely above a whisper. Claire was already calling for an ambulance. At the hospital, the cardiologist explained that the morning strain had aggravated a condition Naomi had been managing badly and postponing even worse. She needed medication adjusted, follow-up care, and several weeks without long hours on her feet. "She will argue with every part of that," Annie said. The doctor gave her a knowing look. "Then she needs people around her willing to argue back." Charles sat in the waiting room with the gray-blue scarf folded across one knee. He did not call the press office, the board, or his mother. Claire handled the legal updates from a corner near the vending machines while he watched Annie move in and out of her mother's room with a paper cup of ice water, a phone charger, and the quiet competence of someone who had been caring for an adult longer than she should have needed to. That evening, Naomi allowed him into her hospital room. She looked smaller against the white pillows, though her voice remained her own. "Annie says you have been sitting outside all day. I did not know whether you wanted me in here. I still do not know what I want from you." Charles pulled the visitor chair closer, but not too close. "You do not have to know tonight." Her eyes settled on the scarf in his hands. "You kept it all these years. It was the only part of you I thought I had left." Naomi turned toward the window, where the city lights were reflected against the dark glass. "The doctor says I cannot work for a while. I heard. My rent will not pause because my heart has poor timing." Charles took a breath. "Come stay at my house, you and Annie, while you recover." Naomi looked back at him at once. "I will not move into your home as someone you rescued. Then do not come as someone I rescued." His voice stayed low. "Come as the woman who should have had the right to choose her own life 18 years ago. Come because Annie should not have to care for you alone while trying to begin hers." Naomi's jaw tightened. "You make it sound simple." "No. I know it will not be simple. I know there will be rooms in that house you hate, and mornings when seeing me feels like too much. I am not asking you to pretend we have our old life back. I am asking you to let me be useful in the life that still exists." Annie had been standing near the door, silent until then. "Mom," she said, "the doctor wants you somewhere you can rest. We don't have to call it anything more than that." Naomi closed her eyes. Charles waited, aware that the only honest answer he could accept was hers. "At first," she said finally, "until I am steady again." Charles nodded. At first, the move did not look like a homecoming. It looked like 2 suitcases, a box of Naomi's medications and Annie carrying the old tin box against her chest as they entered a house too large for the 3 people inside it. Charles gave Naomi a room on the first floor near the kitchen so she would not have to use the stairs. He gave Annie a room across the hall and did not call it hers until she placed her nursing school folder on the desk. During the first weeks, they learned one another through ordinary discomforts. Charles brought Naomi tea she did not drink because he kept choosing blends she disliked. Annie told him that buying 6 new winter coats when she needed one was not thoughtful, only excessive. Naomi became angry when he tried to move her cardiology appointment to a private clinic without asking her first. "I spent too long having other people make decisions about my body and my life," she told him. Charles canceled the appointment he had arranged and drove her to the clinic she had chosen. "Better," Naomi said when he pulled into the parking lot. "Not forgiven? Do not rush yourself." For the first time, he smiled without sadness, winning entirely. Annie submitted her application to Lakeshore College of Nursing with an essay about community care, written at the desk in the room she had slowly begun to use. When the acceptance email arrived, she read it twice before running down the hall to her mother. Charles heard their cries from his study and stopped outside the kitchen rather than interrupting. Annie found him there a minute later. "I got in," she said. His face lit before he could contain it. "I knew you would." She hesitated. "I still cannot pay for it. I know, and I still do not want to feel like I was purchased." "You never will be." Naomi joined them, one hand resting against the doorway. Annie, your father paying for your education is not charity. It is a responsibility he was denied the chance to carry from the day you were born. Annie looked at Charles. No buildings named after me, no newspaper stories about the grateful secret daughter. Agreed. And I choose where I study. Agreed. And you do not call the dean. He raised one hand. I will not even learn the dean's name unless you tell me. She studied him, then nodded. All right. Months later, Charles established the Naomi Brooks Scholarship for young black women pursuing healthcare careers. Naomi agreed only after an independent committee was put in charge, and every sentence that sounded like company promotion was removed from the announcement. I am not becoming a brochure for your conscience, she told him. I would not dare try. The following winter, Union Station filled with tables of donated coats, knit hats, and boxes of gloves for families who needed them. Naomi's coffee stand had reopened, though she now worked only short shifts and hired help for the early mornings. That day, she served coffee at the charity table in a cream sweater, laughing as Samuel argued that nobody in Chicago should be trusted to make cocoa without extra marshmallows. Charles carried cartons from a delivery van, wearing an old overcoat and the gray-blue scarf around his neck. Annie, home from her first semester in nursing school, spotted him while sorting children's mittens by size. Wait, she said, walking over. Beneath the old silver stitching was a new line, sewn in Naomi's familiar hand. And Annie brought us home. Annie touched the words with one finger. Mom added that? Naomi came around the table with 2 paper cups of coffee. The scarf had an unfinished story. Before Annie could answer, an older passenger hurrying toward a boarding call dropped a wallet near the donation bins. Annie saw it, picked it up, and ran after him. Sir, you dropped your wallet. The man turned, relieved, and accepted it with both hands. When Annie returned, Charles was watching her. She is like you, he said to Naomi. Naomi handed him his coffee. No, she is the best part of both of us. Outside the station windows, snow settled along the tracks leading out of the city. Charles placed his hand over the scarf bearing 3 names and understood that the years taken from them could never be returned. But Naomi was beside him. Annie was walking back toward them. For the first time, he was not carrying a memory through winter. He was standing inside the life it had finally led him home to. This story reminds us that love and truth may be delayed, but they should never be denied. Annie's simple act of returning a lost scarf uncovered years of silence, prejudice, and stolen choices. Naomi teaches us that dignity is not something wealth or cruelty can erase, while Charles learns that regret means little without the courage to face the truth and make things right. The deepest lesson is this: justice does not become wrong simply because it embarrasses those who caused the harm, and sometimes one honest act can lead an entire family home. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.